Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Peter Murphy. I'm Professor of Creative Arts and Social Aesthetics at James Cook University. The title of today's talk is The Creativity Slump, Declining Global Innovation and Post-2008 Economies. Theme 1, Creativity, Productivity. The simplest measure of human creativity is economic productivity. Productivity is institutionalised ingenuity. The rate of productivity increase or decrease can be thought of as an expression of the success or failure of innovation and its applications. It is innovation manifest at a very practical, concrete social level. Productivity is a measure of the human capacity to do more with less. It is innovation underpinned by fundamental human creation that allows us to do this. In the postmodern era, employment in research and development per capita in OECD countries grew markedly. It tripled in West Germany and France and quadrupled in Japan between 1965 and 1989. From 1994 to 2008, gross domestic expenditure on research and development as a percentage of gross domestic product rose from 2.1% to 2.3% across the OECD, from 2.4% to 2.75% in the United States, and from 2.6% to 3.4% in Japan. Yet globally, amongst the wealthy countries, productivity has been trending down since the 1970s. Australia is a typical example of this. In the 1960s, Australia's annual average rate of growth of labour productivity was 3.1%. After 1970, this falls sharply. In the 1970s, the rate was 1.8. In the 1980s, it was 1.1. This improved a bit in the 1990s, mainly in the second half of that decade, averaging 2.3. Then it fell away again to 1.7% in the 2000s. Thus, while after 1970 investment in higher education and in research increased dramatically, economic productivity declined. This is the converse of what the human capital argument of Paul Romer and others would lead us to believe. Not only that, but also the research yield per real research dollar declined. In respect of the latter, the Australian figures again are revealing and typical. In 1993, Australian academics produced 1.5 publications per head. This metric tumbled as low as 0.6 in 1997. It has been an anemic 1.0 per capita since 2004. During the period, Australia increased its real external funding of research. Total research income in 2011 dollar terms rose from $744 million in 1992 to $3,172 million in 2010. And yet, the number of research publications per $100,000 income fell from 3.6 in 1992 to 1.5 in 2010. Theme 2, the knowledge society was a fake. So, what happened? In the simplest terms, the knowledge society was a fake. It produced less, not more, innovation and creation. Knowledge in the post-1970s era proved more often than not to be a euphemism for bureaucracy. What the knowledge society generated were larger bureaucracies and ever more regulation. The universities were typical of this. The post-1970 university developed as a mass bureaucratic university. Typical of what then happened, the ratio of administrative to academic staff in universities rose from 0.2 to 1 in the 1960s to 0.4 to 1 in the 1980s. In Australia, the ratio inflated rapidly in the late 1980s and early 1990s as a unified national system of bureaucratic centralism and aggressive legal rational proceduralism was instituted across the university sector. By 1996, the ratio of administrative to academic staff in Australia had reached 1.3 to 1, where it has remained ever since. This story is a familiar one across much or most of the OECD. Everyone experiences local variants of it, but the grand narrative is the same. So, is the consequence the spread of procedural, legal rationalism asphyxiates the act of creation. It denies it oxygen. It diverts attention to policy, process and procedure instead of the production of output. Objectivation lies at the heart of innovation and creation. Under bureaucratic conditions, the act of objectivation is subsumed by norm and regulation. Research is overdetermined by research management bureaucracies that value procedure in the place of productivity. This is both a symptom of and also a metaphor for the larger decline of social and economic productivity. Theme 3, we are becoming less creative. In short, today, the more that we research, the less productive we are. This is the very opposite of knowledge society and human capital theory predictions. It is also a reversal of a historical trend that had the most far-reaching consequences for human well-being. And it's in a series of industrial revolutions from approximately 1770 to 1970, the ingenious application of the arts and sciences utterly transformed human standards of living. The economist Deirdre McCloskey puts it this way. 2 centuries ago, the world's economy stood at the present level of Bangladesh. In 1800, in our dollar terms, the average human being lived on $3 a day. A person today in France or Japan lives on $100 a day. In Norway, the average person earns 45 times more than their predecessor did in 1800, a remarkable $145 a day. The Chinese today have got to an average of $13 a day, 4 times the 1800 level, and that average in China is continuing to rise. Today, only 1.1 billion of the world's 6.7 billion people still live on $3 a day. If anything is progress, then that is progress. So what made it possible? It was not any of the usual suspects. It was not education, nor was it trade. it was innovation. It was the institutionalisation of inventions, from automobiles to electronics, constitutional states to antibiotics, that made the difference. Today, however, we are less inventive than we were 200 years ago. We are less fundamentally imaginative in the arts and the sciences, including the social sciences, than we were in the 19th century. We have also fallen significantly far behind the distinctive short burst of technological creativity in the mid-20th century. We see the symptoms of this in declining real economic performance. The chain of creation, innovation and productivity is the driver of real GDP growth and real income growth. When the former declines, so, with lags, does the latter. In addition, real GDP and real income growth drive relative income equality. This is because higher real wages are the most effective vehicle of income proportionality. Not only that, it is innovation-generated growth alone that can lift the poorest up out of the misery of living on $3 a day. Theme 4, from up to down. The data collated by Northwestern University economist Robert Gordon indicates that growth in real GDP per capita from 1300 to 1700 was 0.2% per annum. That is to say, almost nothing. Between the first industrial revolution and the beginning of the 20th century, Britain increased that to just over 1% per annum. In the 1940s and 1950s, the United States achieved a remarkable 2.5% growth in real GDP per capita. After that heroic peak, US growth begins to ratchet downwards. It does this in a series of steep step-like movements in 1964, 1972, 1987 and 2008 to today's level of around 1.3% growth in real GDP per capita. This long historical development is reflected in average real per capita income. In the United Kingdom, in the 1300s, average real income was $1,150 per person per annum in 2010 prices. By 1800, average income was $3,450 per person per annum. It almost doubled a century later, reaching $6,350 per person per annum in 1906. In the United States, in the 28 years between 1929 and 1959, real income doubled again, rising from $8,000 in 1929 to $16,000 in 1959. But then the pace starts to slow. US per capita income doubles again, but this time in the 31 years to 1988. Then the pace slows once more. George Mason University economist Tyler Cowen suggests that a key moment is the early 1970s. He points out that 1947 US median family income, calculated in 2004 real dollar terms, was $21,760. By 1973, that is 26 years later, it had more than doubled to $44,381. In the following 31 years, from 1973 to 2004, median family income rose only to $54,061, which was less than a 22% increase. Cohen points out that with a growth rate of 2% a year, real income doubles in size about every 35 years. At a 3% rate of growth, living standards double about every 23 years or so. But with today's 1 and a bit % growth rate, things are not looking so good. Theme 5, what went wrong? So, what went wrong? In simplest terms, the engine of creation and innovation is spluttering. Stanford University economist Charles I. Jones suggests correctly that most contemporary innovations deliver only a marginal benefit for most people. The converse of this is that fewer and fewer fundamental discoveries are being made. 80% of economic growth during the period 1950 to 1993, Jones estimates, came from the application of previously discovered ideas. He suggests that this latent value was mobilised through investments in education and education-driven research. Jones, like Robert Gordon, and more sceptically Tyler Cowen, thinks education is a plus in this matrix. I have a contrary view. In fact, the decline in income growth, productivity and creative impetus after 1970 closely tracks the rise of mass higher education. While we like to think of education as inventive, in fact, it is principally transmissive. While a handful of universities or university enclaves are discovery-driven, most of the bureaucratic mass universities are not, or at least they are certainly not in practice. Consequently, since 1970, OECD countries have spent a large amount of money achieving a minimal amount of advancement in the arts and sciences. Theme 6, industry promises breakthroughs but doesn't deliver. The same is true of industry. Consider journalist Michael Mandel's observation in 2009 about the multitude of promises made in the late 1990s about the coming biomedical and other revolutions. The world was assured of breakthrough cancer treatments, gene therapies, stem cell therapies, tissue engineering, high-speed satellite internet, cars powered by fuel cells, micro machines on chips and so on. What happened to such products, Mandel asks. A decade on, he noted that no gene therapy had been approved for sale in the United States. Rural dwellers could get satellite internet, but the service was far slower than what had been promised. The terrible economics of alternate energy had not changed much in a decade, and while the biotechnology industry had produced some important drugs, such as the cancer drugs Avastin and Gleevec, Mandel reflected that gains in health technology had been disappointing compared with the sums invested in research. The latter indicates a subtle but lacerating problem. It is not that today there are no breakthroughs, rather the escalating real cost of breakthroughs is a sign of declining real inventive impetus. Mandel observed that 2008 was the first year that the US biotech industry collectively had made a profit. It is not surprising then that the stock index that tracks the pharmaceutical, biotech and life sciences companies in the Standard & Poor's MHP 500 stock index dropped 32% from the end of 1998 to the end of 2007 after adjusting for inflation. The information technology industry was long past its prime, yet its index by comparison fell only 29% over the period. Costs rise in the medical sector today, not least because drug costs rise, not least because research costs rise. But what do we get for all of those costs? Surprisingly little anymore. The big developments in clinical medical science took place between 1935 and 1965, with key advances occurring in antibiotics, steroids, hormone replacement therapies, psychiatric drugs, surgical techniques, anaesthetics, and DNA. The rate of major clinical breakthroughs since has declined. Developments in cancer therapies, psychiatric drugs, and new antibiotics have slowed to an incremental pace that is marked by marginal benefit increases, often severe side effects, and very expensive clinical trialling. In short, we get less for more. Theme 7, the decline of social creativity. If the viewer is still of the opinion that there is no problem, then consider that it is not just technological creativity that is measurably declining. So is the general level of social creativity. The standard test of human creativity is the Torrance tests of creative thinking, the TTCT. The battery was designed by University of Georgia Professor Ellis Paul Torrance in 1966, and multiple versions of it have been devised since then. Its actual origins go back to Torrance's time at the University of Minnesota in the late 1950s. The test, or battery of tests, when administered to children, is 3 times more likely to predict adult creativity than IQ tests do. In 2010, a professor at the College of William and Mary, Kyung-hee Kim, published a reanalysis of nearly 300,000 Torrance scores from 5 decades worth of tests on children and adults administered by the US-based Scholastic Testing Service. The results of Kim's study were chastening. Her research revealed that creativity scores which previously had risen steadily had stopped rising in 1990 and had experienced a statistically significant decline after that turning point. 20 years into the postmodern era, and here's the era that extends from 1970, creativity scores were generally falling off, and some of the subsidiary components of creativity tested for by the Torrance tests had begun to decline as early as 1984. The fall-off was worst among the very young, those aged from kindergarten to 3rd grade. What does this mean? It means that the decline in creation and innovation had begun to extend deeply into the pores of the wider society. Kim found that the decline in creative thinking was steady and persistent from 1990 to 2008 and ranged across the various components tested by the TTCT. At the same time, IQ tests had been trending in the opposite direction, that is, upwards. What this hints at is that a typical postmodern clever country or a smart society like the United States or Australia might manage to be measurably more intelligent and yet at the same time end up being disarmingly less creative. This is a paradox worth reflecting on. It suggests that the habitual identification of education or even general social problem solving with creation is actually misleading. At the very least, it suggests that it is time to retire the cool, clever, smart metaphors of the 1990s and the glib fetishes of knowledge society elites, epitomised in government circles today by America's Obama administration. Theme 8, decline in the arts. The decline in the Torrance test scores is echoed at the highest levels of social creation. Works that have the longest lasting social effects and that have the greatest social, existential and utilitarian significance are at stake here. High-level creation is difficult to objectively measure in any contemporary moment as opposed to the distant past. We simply have difficulty distinguishing between greatness and glibness in our own time. Special pleading ingratiates creative work that is specious. Power, influence, office and status magnify the importance of works that make no lasting contribution to the arts or the sciences. To make a judgment of greatness or not in our own era, we have to step aside from the rhetoric of the booster and look at some hard numbers. Consider the field of the creative arts. In the visual arts, the period between 1890 and 1970, that is between Cézanne and Rothko, was outstanding. What followed was dismal. Almost any postmodern work, that is, works created between 1970 and 2000, was forgettable, bar a handful. Contemporary post-2000 digital media artworks are occasionally interesting, yet, as their name suggests, they lack the kind of strong conceptual identity that marked the modernist era in art. The same creative deficit applies to popular marketed artworks as much as to elite gallery artworks. Rolling Stone magazine's 2012 music industry poll of the top 500 music albums lists 11 works from the 1950s, 105 from the 1960s, 187 from the 1970s, 82 from the 1980s, 75 from the 1990s, 38 from the 2000s, and 2 from the truncated 2010s. This collective judgment and the arc of creation it reveals is an accurate one. More interesting still are the figures from the 1970s. Technically, the creative output of the 1970s exceeds that of the 1960s when we're thinking about the Rolling Stone poll. Excepting that when one drills down into the figures, what is revealed is that 50% of the best 1970s albums came from the first 4 years of the decade, that is, from the years 1970 to 1973. And immediately after that point, there is a sharp drop-off in first-class output. The distinct downward shift after 1973 pinpoints the general problem of creation in the last 40 years. Theme 9, Great Science Was Yesterday. While there is a distinct turning point around 1973 to 74, the arc of creative decline is nevertheless a longer one than 40 years. Technological science is a good indicator of this. A list of the 50 greatest British inventions was compiled by BBC science experts in a 2013 Radio Times poll. It is notable that the decade of the 1820s accounted for a tenth of the poll-nominated biggest breakthroughs in 350 years of British innovation. The decade included Charles Mackintosh's waterproof material, Michael Faraday's electric motor, Joseph Aspdin's cement, George Stephenson's passenger railway, and Edward Beard Budding's lawnmower. The physicist Jonathan Hubner calculated that the peak of global technological innovation occurred in 1870. My calculation is that the peak of US patent registration per capita occurred in 1914, and the peak of US copyright registration per capita occurred in the 1890s. Data of this kind points to a long-run timeline of ebbing cultural creative energy. Within the long-run line of decline that begins around 1870, there is a more recent decline line that begins around 1970. What this points to is that the arts and the sciences of the last 40 years have been in aggregate distinctly inferior in quantity and quality to those of both the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. Theme 10, the originality slump. At the very moment when our own multiple decades long creative recession began back in the 1970s, the philosopher Cornelius Castoriadis observed that the social impetus to discovery had begun to wane radically. He was at the time almost alone in observing this. The postmodern decades were filled with creative boosters, often of a very pretentious kind. Today, Castoriadis's rather than lonely observation is eloquently confirmed by Dean Keith Simonton. Simonton is Professor of Psychology at the University of California at Davis. He has spent 4 decades writing about creativity. In 2013, in the journal Nature, he bluntly stated that the kind of scientific originality that characterised the eras of Michelson and Morley or Einstein had abated. Imaginative leaps today have become much rarer. Domain-specific expertise now dominates science, and while scientific knowledge still advances, it does so on the whole without expanding the deep-set foundations of knowledge. Why? In 1984, Simon had noted that creation works by amalgamating hitherto unrelated insights, as Einstein did when he merged Maxwell's electromagnetic theory with Newtonian mechanics. Simonton put it beautifully when he said that innovation depends on the ability to see relationships between hitherto unconnected ideas or methods and then to fuse them into a new synthesis. In large part, we have lost or we are losing the capacity to do this. Why is this so? Well, the answer at the end of this presentation is exactly the same as the answer at the beginning of it. Our problem is the problem of an excess of bureaucratic legal rationality. Procedural rationality or legal rationalism, the essence of modern bureaucracy and modern procedural organisation, is lethal to creation and innovation. The logic of creation is not procedural. It is not legal rational. It is not a methodical logic of process, policy or procedure. Theme 11, analogical creation. Edward Beard Budding's lawnmower illustrates the logic, or rather analogic, of creation perfectly. Mr. Budding observed a machine in a local cloth mill. The machine used a cutting cylinder, a bladed reel, to trim the irregular textile nap off the surface of woolen cloth in order to give it a regular, even finish. Budding metaphorically, that is to say, imaginatively translated from shaggy cloth fibre to overgrown grass. In doing so, his lawnmower replaced the labour-intensive scythe and saved generations of gardeners from back-breaking work. The analogical leap from textile fibre to lawn grass is typical of the path of creation. Procedural rationality, even of a smart kind, is the antithesis of that strange, imaginative leaping process. Herein lies the issue for contemporaries. In relative historical terms, we are actually not that imaginative. The contemporary preference is to use linear procedural logics in preference to analogical leaping logics. To explore why that is so is beyond the scope of a short presentation. But what is clear is that we live in an age whose atmospherics are quite different from that of the age of Edward Beard Budding. We talk a lot about imagination, of course, but that does not necessarily make our time as imaginative as Budding's age. A good indicator of this is the obsession that our contemporaries have with procedural rationality. The spread of procedural rationality in the past half-century has been massive. The increase in regulation relative to population is a clear symptom of this. The habitual response, not just of organisations, but of citizens as well, is that if we are confronted with a problem, we want immediately to know what system or process will fix the problem. In fact, often we don't fix the problem at all. Rather, we institute a method to deal with problems of its type. This is a habit that leads to a deeper problem, which is now the relative decline over time of creativity. The more that contemporary culture is dominated by procedural rationality, and the more that we load up universities and firms and institutions with bureaucratic modes of organisation and rampant administrative rationalities, in effect, the less creative we are or we become. Why we do this is a story for another time. That we do it is clear. That we are aware of the consequence of what we do is also clear, yet we seem unable to stop doing it. Theme 12, lack of innovation, paucity of creation. Contemporary societies are addicted to procedural rationality. Steps, plans, methods, routes, pathways, courses, techniques, systems and schemes abound. These are helpful in many ways. Indeed, these are indispensable in some ways. But they also have a habit of crowding out the metaphors, similes, allegories, comparisons, resemblances, semblances, and strange affinities by which we couple together what normally stands apart. That is the kind of act act that creates what does not exist. That act animates innovation, and innovation is the spirit that animates the wealth generation and prosperity levers of modern economies. It is a complex chain that extends from metaphorical insight to growth industries. And it takes time, as it took time for Mr. Budding's machine to be turned into the motor mower and the ride-on mower and much more. But complex or not, if the insight innovation impulse weakens, so do its consequences and its effects. This is the underlying story of the post-2008 global downturn. It is not the whole story, of course, for such a story of that kind is multifaceted. Part of it has to do with the great repeating cycles of expansion and contraction that characterise modern economies. The story of the cyclical behaviour of credit, debt, production and consumption is fascinating in its own right. But if we ask ourselves, for example, why it was that central banks in the decade after 2000 locked in low interest rates that fueled speculative investments in real estate that collapsed in 2008, then one answer might be lack of innovation. Look at the case of the personal computer. It was a mass market innovation in the 1990s. Well, what today does a personal computer's operating system or key software offer that these did not offer in 1996 or 2000? The answer is not much, and in fact, often very little. And therein rests the core of the problem. For the less creative that we are, the slower we grow the productivity, prosperity, and ultimately the just proportionality of the world. And upon that conundrum rests our future. Thank you.